Last time, we were looking into the history of Dubrovnik and the Republic of Ragusa, the largely independent state that emerged from around the city and not only held its own through some remarkably turbulent centuries in the Adriatic, but did it in style, with many modern innovations such as orphanages, disease control, public drinking fountains, and many other features that were the equal or even the exception amongst the other great cities of Europe. So yeah, basically, watch the last episode. It's one of our best. It certainly took a lot of work to make, and do us a favour and sub while you're at it. It would really make all the difference. However, while Dubrovnik is a truly incredible city, the Republic of Ragusa did not end at the extent of the city walls. In fact, at its height, the Republic had holdings along a small but significant stretch of the Adriatic, and in an area where all the prime coastal real estate was gobbled up by the Venetians, this makes for a particularly interesting place to explore. And while there's quite a few holdings of the former Republic we haven't made it to, there's still some fascinating and beautiful parts to show you, not least because Dubrovnik is not the only city in the area with vast walls. Let's begin at Ston. As you drive along this part of the coast, back and forth along the contours of the karst landscape, it can be hard after a while to keep track of where you are. With all the small towns that dot the route, the sight of another on the opposite side of a small stretch of water doesn't look that remarkable at first. By the way, please pardon these images taken from moving buses. When you look closer, you suddenly see a wall system so large that you assume it must be just something else altogether less impressive than it first appears. But approaching from the north, you reach the small town of Ston and are greeted by an unnervingly large wall system. The village of Ston itself hardly seems to merit such considerable defences. There's a couple of hotels, one of them had just opened up so I could get an espresso, but that was one of the very few signs of life in this admittedly pretty sleepy village. It's not a criticism, it's beautiful to photograph, but pretty quiet. Winding back a moment. Because the coast along here can blur into one after a while, you may not realise that you've actually gone over a narrow pass onto a large landmass that would be an island amongst the other larger Croatian islands of Brač, Hvar and Korčula, were it not for this narrow 5-kilometre strip just keeping it tethered to the land. And at its narrowest point, as you turn to the east-west axis of the peninsula, there is a mile-long choke point, and Ston is one end of a fortification system that both controls the land access to the peninsula and also goes on to encircle the main town of Ston to the south. I got some pretty good coverage of Ston that I don't want to leave on the cutting room floor, so quick supercut, I guess. As an aside, one of the things this area is famous for, and this certainly wouldn't merit the vast walls of Ston and Ston, this area produces particularly good oysters, and all around the bay of Ston you can see where they're being farmed. I'm afraid at the time I visited, the Coruna fortress was decked out in scaffolding, so there were limited angles I could shoot it without that dominating the shot. But having explored the village, I began climbing the walls. You can see the periodic towers every few hundred yards, and on the inside of the walls you can also see the remains of round towers that haven't survived as well. All of this is part of the building works the Republic of Ragusa undertook after they purchased the Pelješac Peninsula in 1333. The peninsula had changed hands many times, sitting as it was at a sort of awkward edge of several spheres of influence. A small principality of Zahumlje had been set up in the area when the Slavs migrated in, but this was likely under the nominal rule of the Croat kingdom with some regional autonomy. Between the 11 to 1300s it passed to the Serbs, then back to the Croats, then the Hungarians, eventually being ruled by several Bosnian rulers who were jostling for control of the region, and in this web of competing Bosnian powers, Pelješac was sold to Ragusa, allowing the warring factions to focus their attention elsewhere. Ston may not have seemed very valuable at this point, not least after it had been largely wrecked in an earthquake in 1252. But in the climate of continuing conflict between Bosnians, but also the Serbs and the Ragusan Republic, Ragusa took no chances and undertook these massive fortifications to shield both the physical territory itself from invasion over land, but also their new source of revenue, which comes into view as you crest the hill just over the walls. As you can see, the clouds have been gradually clearing and the sun emerging during my walk, and you can see that as well as north-south, the walls also soar way up the steep mountainside to form an enclosure crowned with Fort Bartolomeo. However, this route has been out of bounds for a while, so continuing south, and all of a sudden the town of Ston comes into view. And there, beyond it, are the source of Ston's wealth, its salt pans. The area was under Roman control from 167 BC, and even back then the area was being exploited for salt production. Under the Republic of Ragusa, this would flourish again, with the salt trade eventually growing to around a third of the Republic's revenue. During the summer months, these pools can be used to produce up to 500 tons of salt. From this point of the walls, you have an excellent vantage of the whole defensive network, both over Ston and back towards Mali Ston. I think we're going to insert another supercut here. Beginning the descent carefully, apparently they host runs on these walls if you're so inclined, you eventually draw level with the rooftops of Ston. The wall rises again to Stonsky Zidine before falling down to join the encircling walls of the town. These take on a form more reminiscent of Dubrovnik itself, more stocky and curvilinear than the more angular medieval walls so far. Low angle flag shot. Didn't really want the walls to end, but it was at this point I was back to sea level and grabbing a quick espresso to take a breather. However, we still need to see Fort Castillo, which is perhaps the closest architecturally to Dubrovnik's defences, and you can see it's been well restored and cleaned in recent years. It's a pretty straightforward layout. It doesn't have all the projecting angles of later bastion fortifications. It's an angular courtyard surrounded by corner towers and a lower extra level of walls at the base, much like the landward side of Dubrovnik's walls. And I'm annoyed to say I have struggled to pull up anything much substantive about the history of this, so if you'll permit us, one more supercut. The town of Ston itself is beautiful, if a bit quiet. There are all sorts of enigmatic details to trace down the side streets for the sharp-eyed. Some ruined buildings like Mali Ston, a number of interesting churches. There's a lot more I wish I could recount from that day, including the rather interesting circumstances of my return, but we've got more to cover in this episode besides just Ston, so it's time to move things along. Though while we're in the area, the northernmost extent of the Republic on the mainland was at the town of Neum, which also happens to give way to a curious and much discussed border anomaly. Neum today is a 5-mile wide territory that connects what would be the otherwise landlocked Bosnia to the sea, but in so doing actually makes the Dubrovnik region into an exclave. And to look at, it's a head-scratcher how this state of things came about. Neum was originally part of the Zahumlay territory that was sold to the Republic. However, in the 1699 Treaty of Karlowitz, the Republic ceded it to the Ottomans, more specifically the Ottoman territory of Bosnia, to create a buffer between them and the Venetians. Now, this territorial configuration that gives Bosnia a narrow corridor to the sea was a preserved feature through the 20th century, even during the Yugoslav years where all the countries were united, and out the other side, such that now a coastline that is entirely part of Croatia is interrupted for just 5 miles by Bosnia. Now, at the time I visited Ston, this means the coach had to cross the borders twice. This is not the Schengen area down here, so the queues of vehicles having passports examined again in under 20 minutes always feels about as silly as you can get. However, this is no longer the status quo. I'm annoyed I don't have good footage of this, but at the time I was there, it was still under construction. But now, the Dubrovnik exclave is linked by road, allowing you to bypass 2 sets of border crossings at Neum. Anyway, just thought it was worth mentioning as it's a holdover from the days of the Ragusan Republic. A little further north, the Republic ever so briefly had possession of Var, Brač and Korčula from 1413, and this was after the islands had been passed between the Venetians, pre-Treaty of Zadar, then the Crown of Croatia, then King Tvitko of Bosnia. The bishopric of Korčula had already fallen under Ston and Ragusa for a century or so. However, while this would have been a major expansion of the Republic, the 3 islands only stayed under the nominal control of Ragusa for about 8 years before submitting to Venetian rule. Little recap here. Ragusa was the exception to the Venetian rule. Ooh, that's a fun wordplay, I wish I thought that sooner. In an Adriatic dominated by Venetian ports, Ragusa became one of the very few holdouts, and since we've spent in excess of 6 years exploring every form of Venetian territory we can get to, it's interesting to see the contemporary architecture of a power in the region not under their control. Anyway, for more on Var and Korčula, we have episodes on both of those, so check those out later. Heading south to the islands the Republic did hold, just off the coast to the north of Dubrovnik, the Elaphiti Isles are an archipelago of around 15 islands and islets, of which there are 3 of significant size you can visit. From above, you can see the reason for their name. Sort of. It comes from the Greek elaphos, which means deer, and looking at Shipan, it sort of looks like a deer leaping. I mean, to my eyes, it looks a bit close to a rabbit, but not to split hairs. Whee! Rabbit jokes. Perversely, there's no evidence of deer having lived on the Deer Islands. Quick aside. To be honest, last episode with the Dubrovnik script, the real challenge was finding English sources, but for a city of that size and importance, there were thankfully some available. When you get out to smaller places like Ston or the Elaphiti Isles, that challenge is compounded. It's also entirely possible, probable even, that the history on a small island just wasn't being meticulously documented in the first place. So this episode is a bit light on historical details. I wish I had more to shade in the gaps, but in the end, we're just left with a bit of an outline. But it's not for lack of looking. So the Elaphitis, the largest of the islands is Shipan. Easily the most striking building on Shipan as you pull into the eastern port of Sudrad is the summer residence of Stejapovic Skochebuha with its fortified tower. Frustratingly, these are kept as private residences and not usually open to visit. Built at the end of the 1500s and built pretty sturdy to defend against piracy in the area. And yes, frustratingly, I have struggled to bring up much about the history of Shipan before it comes into the control of the Republic of Ragusa. We are confident of residence on the island in antiquity. There's a Roman villa that plenty of brief histories of Shipan are happy to name drop. However, nowhere, but nowhere, can I find any pictures or a location of this, so it might just be archaeology. The name Shipan only appears in sources in 1371, and while Lopud and Kolachep appear to be under the control of Dubrovnik from the early days of the city, that's pre-1000 AD, it's not clear whose influence Shipan was under. We know there are Croat churches being built there in the 12 and 1300s, including a Templar shelter, but since the Croat crown rarely had the final say in the area, exact control before 1426 at least remains unclear. Heading south, you get to Lopud. This has a Franciscan and Dominican monastery on the island, built in 1483 and 1482 respectively. Looking back, I have embarrassingly little usable footage from Lopud. This is the fortress. The Franciscan monastery spire was sadly decked in scaffolding for our visit. You can see a Napoleonic fortress at the very top of the island, but as with all the other Napoleonic fortresses in Croatia, we didn't really prioritise them. There's one above Dubrovnik itself, which I happened to stumble upon the first morning. There's one a ways back on Var, one on Lokrum, which we just briefly saw. It's all just a little later than our area of interest, and look, we can't do everything. Finally, the smallest of the main 3 Elaphitis, Kolachep, is a charming little island closest to Dubrovnik. And it has the claim to fame that 2 of the sailors on the Santa Maria, aka Columbus voyage to the Americas, were from Kolachep. As I mentioned last episode, I haven't found any sources I'd call reliable to confirm this fact beyond doubt, so it may just be a myth. Maybe unsurprisingly, shipbuilding was one of the main trades and sources of wealth for all three of these islands. I wish we had a little more history I could share, but while in England, islands like these would be something of an exception or a curiosity, the modern territory of Croatia incorporates somewhere over 1,000 islands. Not all of them have their history meticulously documented. When we visited, I wasn't quite the church-crawling enthusiast I am now, so while the islands all claim churches of very early foundation dates, as early as the 9 or 1000s, I sadly have little or nothing to show of these. So in shame, we'll move on to the other main island in the area, this time pivoting to the opposite side of Dubrovnik. We barely had time to look at Lokrum Island last time. Compared to the packed streets of Dubrovnik, Lokrum is densely wooded with scarcely a handful of buildings, making it lovely for an afternoon walk, but harder to pass history-wise. The most significant structure on the island is the monastery, a Benedictine order founded on the island in 1023. The monks were forced to leave at the end of the 1700s, and there's salacious stories of the curse they left upon the island. There's also a legend about Richard I of England being shipwrecked here. It's difficult to tell how well attested this is. It appears not very. It sounds a little too close to the story of Richard being shipwrecked on Cyprus, and the chronicles that do make these claims conflict with other sources we have on Richard's life, leaving their accuracy in doubt. It is possible that he passed through the region on the return from the Crusades. I've actually struggled to find much on how populous the island has been in history. Its forested appearance now is most likely thanks to its private ownership and use as a summer residence by the Austrian aristocracy. I'm annoyed I don't have a decent shot of this, I just didn't know about it when we visited. There are ruins of a lazaretto, that's a quarantine centre, built on the island in 1533 as part of the Republic's effort to better control disease. It is apparently unfinished, and while I can't find a good source for this, it's been suggested that the lazaretto would have made too good a fortification for any conquering force looking for a beachhead. And yes, I don't know if cannons from much before the 1800s would have had the range to fire on the city itself from Lokrum. It's a bit too good a strategic point to leave open unless you're really going to pour the resources into holding it yourself. And yeah, I won't dwell too much on the Napoleonic fort on the island. It's a significant structure and pretty fun to explore, but a bit outside our dates of interest, being post-Republic. Onwards from Lokrum and heading further south still, you reach the Konvalj region. Now this is a region bordered by Montenegro and still, of course, Bosnia to the north. I wish I had more and better footage of here, but while I don't think you'd find a tremendous amount to see in this part specifically, I mean, one of the biggest things here is just Dubrovnik Airport itself, but there is one survivor from the Republic that I specifically wanted to see. Sadly, on the day it was raining, but this is Sokol Grad, a restored Ragusan castle on a high rock in a commanding position over Konvalj. Its strategic location means its history goes way back. There's artefacts found at the site from habitation dating back to the early Bronze Age. After the Romans conquered the Illyrian tribes, including the Ardeans, who controlled this region, they likewise fortified the rock, and it remained that way till around the 600s when the Slavic migrations into the area drove the Byzantine forces out. It's hard to be precise on the next period from lack of archaeology, but we know it had changed hands several times in the 12 and 1300s before it ended up in the hands of two Bosnian dukes, Sandali Hranic and Petar Pavlović. We're not clear the exact structure of the earlier fortifications, as the Republic of Ragusa was going to make considerable remodelling of the structure in stone, but it's likely that the previous fortification was at least partly in wood. In the 1420s, the Republic of Ragusa was negotiating the purchase of Konvalj from several Bosnian lords, and Sokol Grad was given to the Republic in 1423. But while the rest of Konvalj was sold to Dubrovnik in 1426 by Radosław Pavlović, he seemed to have had buyer's remorse, as he later claimed in 1429, without documents it has to be said, that some citizens of the Republic still owed him money, and he seized some trade caravans, eventually resulting in conflict. The conflict could have had more far-reaching consequences, as Pavlović was supported by the Ottoman Sultan, but eventually Ragusa prevailed and a peace was negotiated. It's quite an unusually shaped fortress. The fortifications follow the contours of the rock, providing some promontories that project outwards from the main body in quite odd angles. It's actually built on 3 levels. The lowest level designed to provide protection for the population if they needed to be protected inside during an attack. The upper 2 layers were then reserved for the military, including accommodation and domestic spaces. While it appears to have weathered the earthquake of 1667, shortly afterwards it falls out of all written records and appears to have been abandoned. Okay, so that's pretty much all we've got for you. As with any episode, I'm embarrassed with all the places we don't have footage for. The Rector's Palace in Slano is a good example of Ragusan architecture, but while we've passed through it on the bus, we haven't made it to Slano yet. We also haven't made it to all the islands of the Republic. Apart from the more obscure of the Elaphitis, the biggest omission here is Millet. A large portion of the island is a nature reserve, and despite its considerable size, there's very little I could film there of historical significance to the Republic. See also Lastovo. It has a nice little castle that we call to visit, but it's quite a long way further out. Other than that, I hope we've given a reasonable cross-section of the Republic these last 2 episodes. You want to know something that's making me genuinely sad? I've been looking forward to doing these for so long, and having covered most of what there is to say, particularly on these somewhat smaller locations like Ston, there just aren't volumes and volumes of books to write on the town. It's lovely, but it is finite. And having gone through and edited all this, it just makes me want to go right back and film it all again and do some more, but that's it. We've basically said most of what can be said about Dubrovnik and virtually all we've been able to pull up on Ston. And I'm genuinely sad I can't keep going back and making more history content on these. Beyond the territory of Ragusa to the south, you get into Montenegro and the territory controlled by the Venetians with Herceg Novi and the Bay of Kotor. And then back up to the north, as well as the islands of Var and Korčula, you reach Split and Trogir. All of the above covered in Venetian architecture. And so, with that, the door is finally open to kick off our Venetian series that we have been teasing since before the sun ignited. So hey, drop us a subscribe, and all that is coming very soon. If you've been enjoying the music in the background, that's ours. You can find it all on bandcamp.com, and if you want to support the channel, that's the place to do it. Otherwise, we'll catch you very soon for our episodes on the Venetian Republic.